Good afternoon. I'm Kim Hall from the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to talk to you again 8 minutes on ecosystems, a really big topic. So I'm going to try to hit some highlights and do a balance between kind of reminding us all about why we care about ecosystems, a little bit about the sensitivity of ecosystems, and then how we can use the services that ecosystems provide to both benefit our own safety under the risk of climate change and also continue to benefit the natural systems. Oops, not the right arrow. There we go. So I think in many cases when people hear that are speakers from the Nature Conservancy, you're going to expect us to talk primarily about what we think of as sort of undisturbed nature. So beautiful forests, coastal wetlands, waterfalls, and cool organisms like this painted turtle. And I think that that's really how our organization began 60 years ago. But as we look forward, and obviously this has been going on the past few decades, we are realizing that more and more to protect these systems, we need to be thinking much more broadly. Yes, there we go. And thinking about all of the ecosystems that are in our region. So including the agricultural systems, including the systems that are heavily used by people, and thinking about the benefits to people as well as the benefits to nature, and thinking again about urban nature. So both thinking about the protecting the diversity of nature that is present in urban systems, but also thinking about the benefits that nature provides to the people in those systems. And again, thinking very broadly about how all of these pieces fit together and how the sensitivities of natural systems to climate-related changes also puts us at risk, and again, how the services that nature provides can reduce those risks. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about these services? And here's just kind of one way of grouping the different aspects of ecosystem services into some categories. First, I think this is obviously a really familiar one, provisioning services. We get all of our food, fresh water, fuel wood, fiber, biochemicals are all coming from some sort of natural process or species. We've also got a whole group we refer to as regulating services, and often these are less well recognized. We're not really thinking about the fact that forests provide a water purification service, that wetlands provide flood control, that insects and birds and other species provide pollination benefits to agriculture. All of those types of things are basically happening. We're not paying for them, but if they're disrupted, we clearly have some problems. Similarly, there's often not a really direct connection between what we think about in terms of protecting nature and all the values that are associated with the spiritual side, the educational side, the recreational side of nature. And all of those things, again, are tied into the risk related to climate change. So again, as came up earlier, if we start to lose that winter up in the UP, for example, I think that has a big effect on how we think about where we're from, our vision of home, and a lot of other important services that are connected to it's not like it used to be, and how are we going to still live in this place. And finally, the one that I'm married to a soil scientist is probably one of the least recognized set of services that are provided by natural systems, or all of these supporting services that let all of these other things happen. So soil formation, nutrient cycling, just the fact that plants capture energy from the sun and convert it into forms that other species can use. All those kinds of things have the potential to be disrupted because the climate is changing so quickly. And I apologize to anyone who has seen me talk in the last 6 years, because every time I do a talk, this slide's in here, and I keep trying to take it out, but I feel like it's really important to go back to the basics and basically remind us of the very pervasive ways that temperature affects wild species. And we've been talking a lot about water, and obviously either too much water or not enough water is really important for natural systems too. But the temperature one is often just harder to recognize in terms of all of the many ways that temperature change can affect wild species. So if you go back to your basics in biology, you'll remember that temperature is a biological factor that basically can shape an entire life history. So you're talking about a set of traits or characteristics that have developed over evolutionary time, and now we're changing temperature at such a rapid rate that we're putting stress on many different aspects of species' life histories, and species together are developing, forming the ecosystems that we depend on. For insects, reptiles, fish, all the species that we think of as cold-blooded, also called ectotherms, that temperature relationship is even more pervasive because the water or the air that those species are in can very strongly influence their internal body temperature, which means their entire metabolic rate is affected by the temperature, which means that how much they need to eat is affected, which means that how much time they spend looking for food is affected, which increases their risk of predation and all those kinds of things. So there are all these strong networks of effects that happen as a result of changes in temperature. Another strong impact that we've heard a little bit about already today is just the fact that temperature acts as a cue for the timing of seasonal events. So in the ecological sense, you've got when leaves unfold in the spring, when birds migrate, when insects emerge. They're often either triggered by temperature or a combination of temperature and day length. And finally, in our aquatic systems, it's really important to remember that oxygen is influenced by water temperature. So the colder it is, the more oxygen you have. So 15 years ago, when I was a grad student here at U of M, I worked on a synthesis of pulling together just evidence that species were even responding to the change that we already had. And also as an ornithologist, we pulled out a lot of bird examples. Some of the first ones that came out really served to help raise awareness on climate change issues. And that figure up at the top there is an early report from the National Wildlife Federation just suggesting that the range of the Baltimore Oriole, shown in gray as the current range, was likely to be shifting up out of Baltimore in roughly 2050, so that kind of gets people's attention. Those kinds of changes are one of the major ones we think about in terms of ecological responses to change. Are species going to try to track the change and move to where the temperature is more suitable for them? Birds obviously have a pretty good potential to move. A lot of other species are a lot less likely to be able to move. Similarly, a lot of the changes that were first observed had to do with changes in timing. So birds arriving earlier, like this yellow warbler that over on the shores of Lake Erie, just last spring actually. But we see a lot of evidence that they're changing already. The impact that we're worried about is that they'll change at a different timing or rate than the resources that they depend upon. So are they going to get there when the insects are available or not available? Those are the kinds of things we were initially worried about. As we start digging deeper into all of the different potential sensitivities of our ecological systems and the species, we start seeing a whole range of different kinds of impacts. And this complexity is really one of the major challenges of trying to protect biological systems. Up here on the far right are moose. They're very temperature sensitive. In particular, it influences their disease resistance. This is a species we're going to lose. There's really no two ways about it. Going up across to the top, we have lake whitefish, another temperature-sensitive species in terms of water temperature, but also very sensitive to the loss of ice cover in terms of their eggs are very susceptible. They're in the east. They're along the coastal margin. If you have a lot of freeze-thaw events, they tend to get scoured in that freeze-thaw. Next one down here is the Carner blue butterfly, one that we're very concerned about with respect to changes in phenology. So the timing of their host plant is often changing differently than the timing of when they're emerging from earlier life stages. Down here is the dwarf lake iris, one we would be worried about because it has a very narrow range of where it lives, and it's about this big and not likely to be able to shift across large areas if that area does become unsuitable for it. And finally, a couple examples from the ag sector, tart cherries, which we talked about earlier in Don's presentation. Having that warm spring makes them much more susceptible to frost because they're leafing out earlier. And this last one is a corn ear borer, which is a species that we don't currently have, at least not very often in the upper Midwest, but it's very common to the south of us. It's one that we have a nice connected landscape of agriculture that potentially as that warming winter becomes more and more warm, these guys are going to be a lot more common in our agricultural systems. So when we think about adaptation in the natural resources sector and biodiversity conservation sector, it's really important to remember what we're starting from in terms of this landscape. This is the National Land Cover data set from a few years ago. All of that kind of creamy white color is agriculture, with red being urban-dominated systems. All the other colors are a more natural system. But again, if you're worried about being able to move across this landscape and you can't fly, there's a lot of agriculture to move through. And then some great big Great Lakes barriers, as was mentioned earlier. We also got a lot of other pieces that make these systems less adaptable. First is that we've converted them. We've drained a lot of our wetlands, which reduces our ability to absorb water in a lot of these systems. We've altered the hydrology of other systems, either by pulling groundwater out or putting in dams and barriers. We've got all sorts of forms of habitat loss and fragmentation, invasive species pollution, all those kinds of things. One of the things that comes out when you think about impacts to biodiversity in the North America region is that everybody talks about sea level rise and things that are happening on either coast, or the loss of species habitat at the tops of mountains. And one thing that I feel like is really important for the Midwest is that we've got two really big issues here. We've got really high rates of warming, and we've got no topography to speak of. So if you want to be able to track those changing climates, you really have to move a long distance. And Don got into this earlier, but in this image from Laurie et al. In 2009, it's estimating the rate of migration that these species need to be able to keep up with is over 1 kilometer a year. So again, talking about those little lake iris, it's not going to happen. The other challenge certainly is complexity, and I'm not going to go into this, but we've got lots of different impacts happening on the same system, lots of different drivers of change, and how do we actually respond to all of those at the same time? The thing I'd like to end with here is basically, as we're talking about all of these different sectors together, is that by recognizing all these services that natural systems are providing, we can really take advantage of those in trying to protect our human populations as well as our natural populations, in particular highlighting those regulation services. And when we're thinking about soaking up more water, let's think about more wetlands, those kinds of things. And I'll stop there before you come get me.
I'd like to invite our company. It would be about the clients or the consumers that purchase my products. It would be about my employees and how they got to work, and it would be about